The office always felt strange at night, empty and still, as if the building itself was asleep. Most of my coworkers were long gone by the time I wrapped up my shift, leaving me alone with the hum of computers and the occasional clatter from the HVAC system. I didn't mind the solitude, at least most of the time. The quiet gave me space to think, a welcome break from the noise of the day. Tonight was no different. The hands of the clock inched toward 11 p.m., and I was finishing up some paperwork, marking off tasks from my to-do list. Outside the windows, the office parking lot stretched out under a sea of dim lights, the shadows between the parked cars deep and unmoving. I knew the layout of the place by heart, every desk, every cabinet, every flickering light in the hallway. Familiar, predictable. There was a comfort in the routine. The silence was soothing, the fluorescent lights humming above me like a lullaby. I glanced at the time again, just a few more minutes and I'd be out the door, on my way home to collapse into bed. Or so I thought. Just as I was about to finish, I heard it, a sound so faint I almost missed it. A shuffle. Maybe a soft thud. It was hard to place. I stopped what I was doing, my hand frozen over the papers, and strained to listen. The building was old, and noises weren't unusual. The air ducts groaned from time to time, and the walls sometimes creaked like an old ship at sea. But this was different. It wasn't the usual hum of machines or the sigh of the ventilation. It was subtle, deliberate, like someone moving through the office carefully, trying not to be noticed. I scanned the room, half expecting to see something out of place, but everything was where it should be. The desks sat neatly in their rows, the printers silent, and the hallway outside was empty. I shook my head, trying to dismiss the unease building in my chest. It was probably nothing. Maybe the HVAC kicking in. I told myself not to be ridiculous and went back to my work. But the silence felt heavier now, as if the building was watching me, waiting. The minutes dragged. I kept my head down, but the feeling of being watched stayed with me, making the hair on my arms stand on end. I told myself again it was just nerves, the byproduct of being alone too often in a quiet space. I even laughed at myself, trying to shake the paranoia. Then the flicker of blue and red lights danced across the office windows. I froze, my heart leaping into my throat. A moment later, I heard the low hum of engines outside, followed by the unmistakable sound of a knock on the front door. I stood slowly, my mind scrambling for an explanation. When I opened the door, 2 police officers were waiting, their faces calm but serious. One of them, a tall man with tired eyes, gave me a small nod. "Good evening, ma'am. We're investigating reports of an intruder in the area. Do you mind if we search your office to make sure everything is secure?" An intruder? My stomach twisted at the word. I glanced back into the office, suddenly aware of how alone I was, but I nodded, stepping aside to let them in. The officers moved inside without hesitation, their eyes sharp and alert. I stayed near the door, my arms crossed tightly over my chest, watching as the officers began their search. They checked every room, every corner, and every cabinet with quiet efficiency. I tried to stay calm, but the longer they took, the harder it became to keep my thoughts from spiraling. What if there really was someone in the building? What if they'd been hiding here the whole time while I worked, watching me without my knowing? I could feel my pulse quicken, my hands growing clammy. The office, which had always felt like a safe and familiar space, now seemed different. The shadows felt deeper, the quiet heavier. Every creak and groan of the building made my heart race. I hugged myself tighter, glancing toward the hallway where the officers were still searching. The minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and the stillness pressed down on me, suffocating in its weight. Finally, the officers reappeared, their footsteps light but deliberate. One of them met my gaze and gave a small, reassuring nod, but I could see the tension in their faces. Something wasn't right. I tried to shake the sense of dread creeping over me, but it clung stubbornly, like a dark cloud that refused to lift. Something was waiting to happen. I could feel it, as sure as the air felt thick and stifling. The officers moved toward the hallway with more purpose now, and when I followed, I noticed their shoulders tense. Something had changed. Their initial calmness was gone. When they reached the farthest office, I heard the unmistakable scrape of something heavy being shifted. One of the officers called out, his voice firm but controlled. "Come out slowly." hands where I can see them. I felt my breath catch. A moment later, the officers emerged, between them, a man in handcuffs. He looked rough, his clothes rumpled and his hair matted, as if he'd spent hours or longer inside the cramped space where they found him. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, his gaze dark and unsettling. He was hiding inside a large piece of furniture in the back office, the taller officer said. It's a good thing we came by when we did. The room swayed slightly around me. I couldn't stop staring at the man, his expression a mix of defiance and something else, something predatory. My mind raced. How long had he been in there? How long had he watched me without my knowing? The thought hit me like a cold wave, leaving me stunned and breathless. The officers began to lead the man outside, but even as they dragged him toward the door, his gaze stayed locked on me. I could feel it, cold, calculating, as if he was memorizing my face, my movements, every detail. It sent a shiver down my spine. The realization hit hard. He had been in the office the entire time I worked, hidden away in that piece of furniture, waiting for something. Had he planned to attack me, or had he simply been biding his time? The possibilities swirled in my mind, each more terrifying than the last. What haunted me most was how close I had been to danger without ever realizing it. I had walked past that room countless times, focused on my work, completely unaware of the threat lurking just a few feet away. If the police hadn't shown up, would I have gone home safely? Or would the night have ended differently? The officers noticed the shock on my face. One of them placed a hand on my shoulder, his voice soft but firm. "You okay, ma'am?" I managed a nod. The officer's kindness was appreciated, but it did little to quell the anxiety clawing at my mind. "You don't have to stay here," the other officer offered. "We can give you a ride home if you'd like." I didn't hesitate. The thought of being alone in the office, even for a moment longer, made my skin crawl. "Yes," I whispered. "Please." They escorted me to the squad car, and as I climbed into the back seat, I felt a strange sense of detachment, like the world around me had shifted slightly out of focus. The city streets, usually familiar and ordinary, now seemed distant and surreal. I stared out the window as we drove, watching the streetlights blur into streaks of light against the dark sky. Despite the safety of the police car, the unease stayed with me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. What had he been planning? Even with the officers beside me, I couldn't shake the fear. It clung to me like the cold night air, impossible to ignore. When we finally reached my apartment, the officers offered to wait until I was safely inside. I thanked them and hurried up the steps, locking the door behind me the moment I was inside. I still felt a little uncomfortable, but just being at home made me feel a lot better. Working nights wasn't ideal, but I had gotten used to it. The factory was always quiet during these shifts, with only 3 of us manning the place. I handled the hands-on work, packaging, maintenance, whatever needed doing, while the woman ran the computers. A third guy was around, but he mostly stuck to his tasks in another room, leaving the 2 of us in the main area. It wasn't a bad gig. Slow nights gave me time to think, and the silence was almost peaceful. Still, I never let my guard down entirely. It was like a muscle memory from the years I spent practicing jujitsu, an awareness that lingered, even though I hadn't trained in years. The hum of machines filled the space, broken only by the occasional clang of metal or the low rumble of the HVAC. I settled into the rhythm, hands busy with a small repair job, already counting down the hours until the shift ended. But that night, the quiet wouldn't last. It started with a knock at the door, loud, unexpected, cutting through the steady hum of the factory floor. I looked over at the woman who paused mid-keystroke at her computer. "Should I open it?" she asked, her voice low with hesitation. We weren't used to visitors this late. Most deliveries and contractors handled their business during the day. At night, the doors stayed locked, and the few people who worked inside had no reason to expect company. "Yeah, open it," I said, though I felt the same unease. "It's weird, but maybe it's nothing." I shrugged, trying to play it off, but something about the knock had already put me on edge. The woman unlocked the door, and 2 men stepped inside. At first glance, they seemed ordinary. Casual clothes, relaxed expressions. They smiled, offered polite greetings, and said they were just passing by. But something felt off about them, though I couldn't place what. They lingered just a little too long at the entrance, their eyes scanning the room in a way that made me uneasy. The conversation was harmless enough at first, small talk about the area, asking vague questions about what the factory produced, but the longer they stayed, the more uncomfortable it became. The woman kept glancing at me from her desk, her unease growing by the minute. Something about the way the men spoke didn't sit right. They gave vague answers when asked why they were here. I noticed the way they kept looking around, their eyes lingering on the equipment, the exits, and most unsettling of all, on us. It wasn't curiosity. It was calculation. The air in the room felt heavier, charged with tension. I knew the woman was thinking the same thing I was. Should we call the police? She hovered near her phone, uncertain whether to pick it up. My gut told me the situation was turning, and I needed to act fast. I decided enough was enough. "All right, fellas," I said, stepping toward them. "That's enough. It's time for you to leave." The shift in their demeanor was instant, like a switch flipping. The polite smiles vanished. One of them smirked, a mean curl to his lip, while the other took a step closer, his posture aggressive. "We're not going anywhere," the smirking one said, his voice low and deliberate. I felt my muscles tighten, instinct taking over. It had been years since I'd trained in jiu-jitsu, but the movements were still there, buried deep in muscle memory. I closed the distance quickly, grabbing the closest man and taking him to the ground with a fluid sweep. He fought hard, but I locked him in a chokehold, pinning him under my weight. For a moment, I thought I had control of the situation. The man squirmed beneath me, gasping, but he wasn't going anywhere. Adrenaline surged through my veins, and I tightened the hold, waiting for him to go limp. But I hadn't accounted for the second intruder. Just as the first man's resistance began to weaken, pain exploded in the side of my head. The second intruder had blindsided me, landing a heavy blow before I even realized he was moving. My vision blurred, and the room tilted as I stumbled, struggling to keep my balance. I tried to stay upright, but my legs wobbled beneath me. The sharp throb in my head made it hard to focus, and I could feel the strength draining from my limbs. The man I had pinned wriggled free, coughing and gasping as he scrambled to his feet. The two of them stood over me, their expressions dark with satisfaction. The smirking one rubbed his throat, glaring down at me. "Nice try," he muttered, his voice rasping. My body screamed at me to get up, to fight back, but I couldn't. My muscles refused to obey. I could only watch helplessly as they shifted their attention to the woman at the computer booth. The woman had been frozen, watching the fight unfold with wide eyes. But the moment she saw me go down, her survival instincts kicked in. Without a second's hesitation, she bolted into the booth and slammed the door shut behind her, locking it with trembling hands. The two men lunged toward the booth, but they were too late. They pounded on the door, yelling threats, but it held firm. I could hear them cursing, slamming their fists against the glass in frustration, but the woman didn't budge. She grabbed her phone, her hands shaking, and called the police. I lay on the ground, still dazed, listening to her rapid, frantic voice as she explained the situation. The intruders knew they couldn't reach her, and their frustration quickly turned to anger. One of them kicked the booth door with a snarl, but it didn't give. Realizing the door was impenetrable, they gave up on her and turned their attention to the factory instead. They began rifling through tools, parts, and anything they could carry, stuffing whatever they found into their pockets and bags. I managed to drag myself upright, every movement slow and painful. My head throbbed with each heartbeat and my vision was still unsteady, but I forced myself to stay awake. The intruders moved chaotically, knocking over boxes and scattering equipment as they rummaged through the factory. They barely spared me a glance, more focused on stealing than finishing what they had started. I knew I couldn't stop them, not in my current state, but I hoped the police would arrive before they did too much damage, or worse, decided to try again. Minutes later, I heard the distant wail of sirens. The sound gave me a jolt of relief, though the men didn't seem to notice until the flashing red and blue lights cut through the windows. The intruders cursed, dropping what they had stolen and sprinting toward the exit. They bolted out the door just as the first squad car pulled into the lot. disappearing into the night like shadows fleeing from the light. The officers rushed inside, weapons drawn, scanning the factory for threats. One of them knelt by my side, asking if I was okay, but I could barely focus on his words. I pointed toward the door, trying to explain that the intruders had escaped. The officers nodded, radioing to the other patrol cars to start a pursuit. I sat on the ground, leaning against a workbench, as the woman emerged cautiously from her booth. Her face was pale, her hands still shaking, but she was okay. She knelt beside me, her relief obvious, though the fear hadn't fully left her eyes. Not long after, we got word from the police. One of the men had been caught a few streets away. The other was still on the run. The officers promised to keep searching, but I could tell from their expressions that it wouldn't be easy. Hours later, the search ended without success. The police took our statements and assured us they'd keep looking, but it was clear the other man had slipped away into the night. Back at the factory, we surveyed the mess they had left behind. Broken tools, scattered equipment, and the lingering sense that something worse had almost happened. Raising 2 kids alone meant taking whatever work I could find, and cleaning offices overnight wasn't the worst option. The hours were peaceful, the pay was decent, and for once, the solitude felt like a gift. No one demanding my attention, no laundry piling up, no school lunches to prepare, just the quiet hum of the office as the city slept. I followed the same routine every shift. Wipe down desks, empty waste bins, mop the floors, and move on to the next room. The building was almost too quiet, save for the occasional murmur of the air conditioner or the distant click of a thermostat switching on. It gave me time to think, to breathe, even if the thoughts weren't always pleasant. I moved steadily from room to room, wiping down keyboards and straightening chairs. As the night crept on, the office around me felt still and lifeless, like I was the only person left awake in the world. The first strange noise was barely noticeable, a dull thud somewhere down the hall, like something soft falling to the floor. I paused mid-swipe, the wet cloth dangling from my hand. Listening closely, I strained to hear more, but the building fell silent again. Just the AC whirring softly. Probably nothing, I told myself. Maybe a binder had slipped off a shelf, or the wind had shifted something outside. I returned to my work, trying to shake off the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Minutes later, another noise. This one a soft scraping sound, like something being dragged across the floor. My hands froze again, my pulse quickening. I glanced toward the hallway, expecting to see someone, but it was empty. The shifting shadows at the edges of my vision made me uneasy, but every time I tried to focus, nothing was there. The office suddenly felt colder, and I rubbed my arms, trying to push down the growing sense of unease. This was an old building, I reminded myself. Strange noises were just part of the package. But it was getting harder to believe that as the minutes dragged by. I was near the end of my shift, cleaning the last section of the office. I crouched near a small table, wiping its surface with quick, efficient swipes, eager to finish and get out of there. That's when it happened. Out of nowhere, a hand shot out from under the table and clamped onto my ankle with a cold, tight grip. I gasped, a sharp, involuntary sound that echoed in the empty room. The hand felt like iron, strong and unyielding, as if whoever was beneath the table had been waiting, biding his time for just the right moment. Panic surged through me, hot and overwhelming. I twisted and yanked, trying to pull my leg free, but the grip only tightened. I kicked wildly with my free leg, desperate to break free. My foot connected with something, a solid thud, and the grip loosened just enough. Without thinking, I scrambled backward, heart hammering as I pulled myself free from the man's grasp. I didn't wait to see who he was or what he wanted. I bolted toward the nearest door, my shoes squeaking against the freshly mopped floor. Behind me, I heard him move, his heavy footsteps slapping against the tile, gaining on me with every step. The hallway stretched out ahead of me, endless and dimly lit. My only thought was escape, getting away, getting somewhere safe. But as I ran, my body betrayed me. I tripped over a bucket of supplies, crashing to the ground with a painful thud. For a moment, I thought it was over. The fear pinned me down, making it hard to breathe, hard to think. But somewhere deep inside, the will to survive kicked in. Adrenaline surged through me, and I scrambled to my feet, ignoring the pain shooting through my knees and elbows. I could hear him behind me, his steps heavy and relentless. But I didn't look back. I ran harder, faster, my lungs burning with every gasp of air. The office door loomed ahead, and I threw myself at it, bursting out into the cool night air. I stumbled through the office door and into the night, the cold air hitting my face like a slap. My legs burned, but I kept running, the sound of my own frantic breaths filling my ears. I spotted the glowing sign of a nearby 24-hour convenience store, just a block away. It felt like salvation. The fluorescent lights of the store were blinding as I burst through the door, gasping for air. I leaned against the counter, struggling to catch my breath. The clerk looked at me with confusion, but I ignored his questioning gaze, my mind racing too fast to form words. Pulling out my phone with trembling hands, I dialed the office owner. My voice shook as I explained what had happened. "There was someone inside," I said, trying to sound calm but failing miserably. "I left everything open. I couldn't stay." The owner didn't waste time. "I'm calling the police," he said. His voice was steady, but I could tell he was just as alarmed as I was. "Stay where you are. They'll be there soon." Minutes felt like hours as I waited in the brightly lit store, my nerves still raw from the encounter. I stayed close to the counter, half expecting the man to burst through the door at any moment, though I knew deep down he wouldn't risk it now. Finally, the flashing lights of police cruisers filled the parking lot outside the office. I stayed on the phone with the owner, listening as he relayed updates. The officers moved quickly, sweeping the building from room to room, but it didn't take long for them to confirm what I had feared. "He's gone," the owner told me over the phone. "They searched everywhere. He must have slipped out right after you escaped." I exhaled shakily, a mix of relief and frustration flooding through me. I was grateful to be safe, but knowing the man had vanished left me uneasy. The police promised to investigate further, but I knew their chances of catching him were slim. I stayed inside the convenience store, waiting for the police to come and escort me home. The bright lights that had initially felt comforting now seemed harsh, exposing every nerve and thought I'd been trying to suppress. What if I hadn't kicked free? What if I hadn't made it to the door in time? The clerk kept glancing at me with concern, probably wondering if I was all right. I offered him a shaky smile, though it felt forced. The fear still gripped me, gnawing at the edges of my mind. When the police finally arrived to drive me home, I climbed into the back of the squad car, exhausted but grateful to leave the night behind. The officer driving offered a few kind words, reassuring me that they'd keep investigating, but I barely heard him. My mind was still trapped in that office, replaying every moment over and over again. The ride home was quiet, the hum of the engine the only sound. As we passed darkened streets and sleeping houses, I realized just how close I had come to something terrible. It wasn't just the fact that someone had been hiding in the office, it was the sheer unpredictability of it. The quiet, ordinary night had almost turned deadly, and I had never seen it coming. When we reached my apartment, I thanked the officer and hurried inside, locking the door behind me. The familiar sounds of home, my children breathing softly in their beds, the creak of the floor under my feet, brought some comfort, but the unease lingered. I knew I'd have to return to the office eventually, but not tonight. Tonight, I was grateful just to be home, alive and safe.